There's an old man on his deathbed, and his sons are gathered around him, and he's telling them the truth about his own life for the first time. The sin he never confessed while he had the strength to hide it, the warning he needs them to carry after he's gone. That's Levi, third son of Jacob. And that scene plays out almost word for word the same way. 12 separate times in a book most Christians have never opened. 12 sons, 12 deathbeds, 12 confessions. I treated it as a poem, a formality, 12 short verdicts on 12 sons, and I moved on. It never once occurred to me to ask what a Jewish or early Christian reader, centuries later, might have wanted to do with those cryptic little blessings. What if somebody, somewhere, decided those few verses about each son deserved to be filled out, expanded, turned into a full dying speech, in that son's own voice, explaining exactly what he'd lived through and exactly why his father's blessing said what it said? Somebody did. Tonight, we open that book. This is the story of the testament of the 12 Patriarchs. I want to start, as I always try to, with exactly what we actually know about this book, because I don't want to hand you more certainty than the evidence supports. The complete text survives in Greek manuscripts, the earliest of them from around the 10th century, along with later Armenian and Slavonic translations that confirm the Greek tradition was stable and widely copied across the medieval Christian world. British scholar R. H. Charles, the same scholar whose work we leaned on when we opened the Ascension of Isaiah, produced the first major critical edition of this text in 1908, and for a long time, that Greek manuscript tradition was essentially all scholars had to work with. Then came 947, and the discovery that changed how nearly every book on this channel gets read. The Dead Sea Scrolls found in the caves above Qumran included fragments of something called the Aramaic Levi document, an older independent Jewish text covering strikingly similar ground to the Greek Testament of Levi we're about to walk through tonight. Alongside it, fragments of a Hebrew Testament of Naphtali surfaced as well, closely paralleling another section of our combined book. I want you to sit with the significance of that for a second, because it's the strongest piece of evidence we have for tonight's topic. This wasn't simply a late invented Christian fiction dressed up as ancient patriarchal wisdom. Real, independent, centuries-older Jewish source material, written in Aramaic and Hebrew, sat behind at least parts of what eventually became this Greek book, material old enough and Jewish enough that it was being copied and preserved by the same community that hid the Dead Sea Scrolls away in desert caves long before any Christian editor ever touched it. I want to be honest with you about a real, still unsettled scholarly debate here, because I think it's the single most important caveat for tonight's whole episode. Scholars are genuinely divided on how to describe the finished combined book we have today. R. H. Charles, in that early critical edition, argued this was fundamentally a Jewish document, later touched up here and there by Christian editors, who inserted a handful of clearly Christian passages, references to the Son of God, to a kind of Trinity-shaped theology, into an otherwise Jewish farewell speech tradition. A later, very influential scholar, M. de Jong, pushed back hard against that reading, arguing that the finished Greek Testament of the 12 Patriarchs we actually possess should be read as a Jewish Christian composition from the very start. A work built by Christian hands using genuinely ancient Jewish source material like the Aramaic Levi document, rather than a Jewish text with Christian graffiti scratched onto it afterward. I don't think this argument has been definitively settled either way, and I want you to know that honestly, rather than picking a side and presenting it as fact. What both camps agree on is the deeper point that matters most for tonight. Real, ancient, pre-Christian Jewish material sits somewhere underneath this book, and the finished text we have was shaped at some stage by Christian hands as well. I think that split identity is actually the real reason this book never found a permanent home in anybody's Bible, and I want to name that plainly, because it's a different reason than any of the ones we've covered on previous episodes. This wasn't a text exposed as a forgery the way the fake English Book of Jasher was. It wasn't simply lost to fragments and rediscovered centuries later, the way the Apocalypse of Zephaniah survives only in scraps. This book was always available, always known, copied faithfully for centuries. It just never belonged clearly enough to either community to be claimed as scripture by either one. Too Jewish in its bones to be fully embraced as Christian revelation. Too shaped by Christian hands in its finished form to be preserved as authoritative Jewish scripture either. It fell quietly into the space between two traditions, read and valued by both for centuries, canonized by neither. I want to give you a little more of the historical texture surrounding when this material likely took its final shape, because I think it helps explain why a book built around confession and moral failure would have resonated so strongly with whoever finished compiling it. Most scholars date the core testaments, at least in an earlier Jewish form, somewhere in the 2nd century before Christ, a period of real upheaval for Jewish identity. The Maccabean revolt against Greek Seleucid rule had only recently succeeded. Questions about who held legitimate priestly authority in Jerusalem were sharply, sometimes violently contested, and competing groups within Judaism were each claiming to represent the true, faithful continuation of the covenant. A book built entirely around each of the 12 founding patriarchs, confessing their own specific failure, and each one pointing forward toward a coming, more faithful future. A purified priesthood from Levi, a righteous king from Judah, fits naturally into exactly that kind of anxious, contested moment, when a community needed reassurance that inherited flaws, even serious ones, didn't permanently disqualify a family line from a faithful future. Whether the final Christian-shaped version we have today was completed in the 1st or 2nd century after Christ, that same underlying anxiety about inherited failure and future faithfulness would have carried over naturally into an early Christian community, wrestling with its own uncertain relationship to Israel's covenant promises. Let's open Genesis 49 together for a moment, because I want you to actually hear the seed this whole book grew out of before we walk through its full-grown branches. Jacob, gathering his sons, says of Reuben, "Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel, because thou wentest up to thy father's bed." Of Levi and Simeon together, Simeon and Levi are brethren, instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce. Of Judah, Judah is a lion's whelp. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. Read slowly, these are dense, compressed, almost riddling lines, a single verse doing the work of an entire biography. The testament of the 12 patriarchs takes exactly that seed, one son at a time, and grows it into a full farewell speech, a real human confession of how that son actually lived, why his father's cryptic verdict landed the way it did, and what he wants his own children to learn from watching him fail or watching him triumph. Let's begin with Reuben, because his testament sets the pattern every other son's speech will follow. Reuben, the firstborn, opens by confessing directly what Genesis 35:22 only states in a single flat sentence, that he went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. Genesis gives us the bare fact and moves on immediately, the way genealogical narrative so often does, without a single word of Reuben's own reflection on what he'd done. This testament gives him back his own voice, and it's a genuinely uncomfortable one to sit with. Reuben doesn't excuse himself. He tells his sons the sin cost him his birthright, the double portion, the leadership of his brothers, everything the firstborn should have inherited, and he wants them to understand exactly what carried him into it. Not a sudden temptation out of nowhere, but what he calls the 7 spirits of deceit, a catalog of internal forces, he says, work against every man: the spirit of fornication, of insatiableness, of fighting, of flattery and trickery, of pride, of lying, of injustice. Each one, he insists, opening the door a little wider for the others. I want to pause on that list for a moment, because I think it's worth taking seriously as moral psychology, even completely apart from whatever we decide about this book's canonical status. This isn't a simple morality tale warning against one bad decision. It's an old man honestly naming the internal architecture of his own failure, piece by piece, trying to hand his sons something more useful than a warning, trying to hand them a diagnosis. I want to note, too, how carefully Reuben's testament describes the order in which these 7 spirits are said to typically operate, because it isn't presented as a random list. It's presented as a sequence, each spirit weakening the resistance the next one has to overcome. Fornication, he says, comes first, working through the physical senses. Then insatiableness follows close behind, feeding the appetite that fornication first awakened. Fighting arises from the frustration insatiableness produces when its cravings go unmet. Flattery and trickery step in as tools to get around whatever obstacles that fighting couldn't overcome directly. And pride, lying, and injustice arrive last, each one a kind of hardened, settled state a man reaches only after the earlier spirits have already done their slow, cumulative work on him. I think that ordering is genuinely worth taking seriously as a piece of ancient moral observation. However we ultimately weigh the text's canonical status, a recognition that serious failure rarely arrives all at once, fully formed, but instead builds itself one compromise step at a time, each smaller surrender making the next, larger one easier to justify. I want to sit a moment longer with Reuben's own words about why he's confessing at all, because the testament gives him a genuinely striking line about his motive. He tells his sons he is warning them, in order that ye also may not fall into the like sins, explicitly framing his own worst failure as a deliberate gift to the next generation, rather than a shame to be buried with him. That framing runs through nearly every testament in this collection, and I think it's worth naming as a real structural feature of the whole book, not just a detail specific to Reuben. Confession here isn't primarily about the confessor's own soul. It's pedagogical. It exists for the sake of the children listening, offered specifically so they might recognize the same 7 spirits of deceit at work in their own hearts before those spirits cost them what Reuben's cost him: his birthright, his standing among his brothers, his father's trust. Simeon's testament moves faster, and its central confession is envy. The jealousy he and his brothers carried toward Joseph, the same jealousy that led them to sell their own brother into slavery in Egypt. Simeon tells his sons plainly that envy blinded him to the point of wanting Joseph dead, and that only Judah's intervention, selling Joseph rather than killing him outright, the same detail Genesis 37 records, kept that envy from becoming outright murder. He warns his children that envy is a sickness of the soul that spreads to the body itself, wasting away the flesh, and urges them toward the opposite: a spirit of goodness that genuinely rejoices in a brother's success rather than resenting it. Now let's go into Levi's testament, because I think it deserves real time. It's the theological center of gravity for this entire book, and it's also where the Qumran connection we opened with becomes most vivid. Levi's testament opens with a heavenly ascent, and if that sounds familiar, it should. We've walked through this same visionary architecture before, in 2nd Enoch's 10 heavens, and in the 7 heavens Isaiah ascended through in our last episode together. Levi is shown the heavens opening, an angel guiding him upward through multiple levels, each one holding its own specific inhabitants and its own specific purpose. A lowest heaven storing up punishment for the wicked, higher heavens holding hosts of angels, and the highest heaven holding the very presence and glory of God, described in language the text itself admits falls short of what Levi actually witnessed. In this vision, Levi is anointed for the priesthood directly by angelic hands, marking the beginning of the Levitical priestly line, the very line your own Bible traces from Levi down through Aaron and into the entire sacrificial system of the tabernacle and temple. I want to bring in the real canonical cross-reference here, because it matters. Malachi chapter 2 verses 4 through 7 describes God's covenant with Levi in language your own Bible actually uses. My covenant was with him of life and peace. The law of truth was in his mouth, and iniquity was not found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and equity, and did turn many away from iniquity. That's the ideal the covenant with Levi was supposed to produce, a priesthood of genuine moral integrity, walking in peace, turning people away from sin through the sheer weight of their own faithfulness. And then Levi's testament does something genuinely striking, something I think gives this whole book real prophetic weight, even setting aside its canonical status. Levi doesn't simply celebrate his own priestly calling. he turns, in the second half of his testament, into a warning about what his own priestly descendants will eventually become, a corrupted future priesthood marked by greed, by profaning sacred things, by teaching commandments for the sake of gain rather than genuine devotion to God. I want you to notice how uncomfortably close that warning lands to real documented history. By the time of Jesus' ministry, the priesthood in Jerusalem had, in fact, become deeply entangled with Roman political power, with family dynasties buying and selling the high priesthood, with exactly the kind of corruption your own Gospels record Jesus condemning directly. The money changers in the temple courts, the den of thieves language in Matthew 21, Mark 11, and Luke 19. Whether this testament's warning was written before that corruption fully took hold, watching it develop, or after it had already become an established grievance, its authors were clearly speaking directly into a real, lived tension between what the covenant with Levi promised and what the actual priesthood, in their own lifetime, had become. I want to bring in one more piece here, because I think it's the single most fascinating cross-reference in this entire episode. Levi's testament alongside Judah's testament, which we're about to walk through, together point toward a coming messianic figure. But notice carefully how this book divides that expectation. From Levi's line, a future priestly figure. From Judah's line, a future kingly figure. Two separate anointed figures, two separate lines, two separate roles. And this isn't some isolated invention unique to this one book. That exact two Messiah expectation, a priestly Messiah and a kingly Messiah, kept carefully distinct, appears independently in real documents from Qumran itself, in the community rule in the Damascus document describing a coming Messiah of Aaron alongside a coming Messiah of Israel. I want you to hold that detail up against something we already spent real time with together on this channel. Melchizedek, the mysterious figure from Genesis 14 who held both offices simultaneously, priest of God Most High and king of Salem at once, the very combination Psalm 110 and Hebrews chapters 5 through 7 build an entire theological argument around, precisely because Christ was understood to fulfill both roles in a single person rather than two separate figures. Set side by side, these texts are wrestling from different angles with the exact same theological puzzle. Can one figure genuinely hold both the priestly and kingly offices at once, the way Melchizedek did in that single ancient episode, or does Israel's future require two separate anointed figures to fulfill those roles separately? I find it genuinely remarkable that these ancient communities were independently circling the same unresolved question, using different biblical anchors to reach different provisional answers, centuries before any of them could have known how that question would ultimately be answered. I want to add one more layer to Levi's testament before we move on, because there's a detail in the ascent itself worth sitting with a little longer. The angel who guides Levi through the heavens tells him plainly that he is being shown these things specifically because he has been chosen to draw near to God on behalf of his brothers, that the priesthood isn't simply a reward or an honor, but a genuine burden of mediation, standing in the gap between a holy God and an unfaithful people. I think that framing matters because it reshapes how we should read the warning about priestly corruption that follows. The testament isn't only saying future priests will become greedy. It's saying something sharper, that the very office built specifically to stand between God and human failure will itself eventually become one more instance of that failure. The mediator needing mediation, the intercessor needing someone to intercede for him. That's a genuinely uncomfortable idea, and I don't think this book flinches from it. It hands Levi a glorious calling in one breath and a warning about that calling's eventual corruption in the very next, refusing to let the glory stand alone without the honest caveat riding right alongside it. Now let's turn to Judah, because his testament gives us the other half of that two Messiah picture, and because it doesn't shy away from Judah's own real moral failure either. Judah's testament confesses in real detail the episode Genesis chapter 38 records, his relationship with Tamar, his own daughter-in-law, after failing to give her his youngest son in marriage as custom and covenant required. Judah tells his own sons plainly that drunkenness clouded his judgment, that he didn't recognize Tamar disguised at the roadside, and that when the deception was finally revealed, Tamar was found more righteous than he was, precisely the verdict Genesis itself renders in chapter 38, verse 26, where Judah says of Tamar, "She hath been more righteous than I." This testament expands that single canonical sentence into an extended meditation on the specific dangers Judah wants his own descendants to avoid: wine, and the way it strips a man of discernment; greed, and the way it corrupts judgment, even in matters that should be governed by simple honesty; and sexual immorality, which he links directly back to his own failure with Tamar. And then, out of Judah's own confessed failure, the testament turns to a coming king, a ruler who will arise from Judah's own line, described in language that clearly echoes Jacob's original blessing in Genesis 49, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah," now expanded into a fuller vision of a king who will establish genuine peace, whose reign the text describes almost apologetically, as though this future king will need to atone for the very failures Judah himself has just spent his whole testament confessing. I think there's something genuinely moving in that structure, honestly. The kingly line isn't projected as automatically glorious simply because it's chosen. It's projected as a promise that has to somehow outgrow, redeem, and transcend the real, documented moral failure of the very man it springs from. I want to add one more detail from Judah's testament, because I think it rounds out the picture of what this book is actually trying to accomplish. Beyond the warnings against wine, greed, and sexual immorality, Judah spends real time reflecting on the specific mechanics of how those three failures reinforce one another, how wine dulls the judgment that would otherwise catch greed before it takes root, and how greed, once rooted, makes a man far more vulnerable to exactly the kind of sexual temptation that cost him his own dignity with Tamar. It's a genuinely sophisticated piece of moral reasoning for an ancient text, tracing not just a list of separate sins, but a kind of chain reaction between them, each failure lowering the resistance to the next. I don't think that's an accident of composition. I think whoever wrote Judah's testament had actually watched this exact chain play out in real people's lives, closely enough to describe its mechanics with this much precision. Let's move to Dan's testament, shorter but carrying its own distinct weight. Dan confesses the sin of anger, tracing it back to the family conflict surrounding Joseph, and introduces a figure this whole broader tradition will keep returning to across several of the remaining testaments: Beliar, a name for the spirit of opposition and evil, closely related to the more familiar term Belial you'll find scattered through the Dead Sea Scrolls' own sectarian literature, describing the cosmic adversary standing opposed to God's purposes. I want you to notice the echo here of something Paul himself writes in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 14. Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light, the same basic picture of a deceptive, opposing spiritual power operating just beneath the surface of ordinary human conflict, dressed up convincingly enough that its victims rarely recognize it for what it actually is until the damage is already done. Now, Asher's testament, and I want to slow down here, because this is where tonight's material connects most directly back to an episode we've already spent real time inside together. Asher's testament centers on what scholars usually call the two ways teaching, the claim that every human life is shaped by exactly two competing paths, one of genuine goodness, one of genuine wickedness, and that no person can walk convincingly down both roads at once, however much self-deception might try to convince them otherwise. There are two ways of good and evil, the Testament states plainly, and with these are the two inclinations in our breast distinguishing them. I want you to remember, because I think it matters, the two spirits doctrine we walk through together in the Shepherd of Hermas. The same fundamental architecture, a spirit of truth and a spirit of error contending for the same human heart, dwelling together yet pulling in opposite directions. This exact same dualistic framework, two spirits, two ways, two inclinations, also appears independently in the community rule from Qumran, describing a spirit of truth and a spirit of deceit assigned to govern the whole of human behavior, and later still in the early Christian document called the Didash, which opens with the flat declarative sentence, "There are two ways, one of life and one of death. And there is a great difference between the two ways. Three separate ancient communities, writing across a real span of centuries, independently reaching for the exact same two-path picture of the moral life. I don't think that's coincidence. I think it reflects something these ancient writers all recognized as simply, obviously true about how temptation and integrity actually work inside a single human heart. Not usually a dramatic, single moment of decision, but a whole life's worth of small choices, each one nudging a person further down one road or the other. I want to widen the lens for a moment before we move to Joseph, because I think it's worth pausing to notice how differently this book treats its most virtuous sons compared to its most flawed ones. Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Dan, Gad, each of them opens his testament with real named failure. But not every son in this collection is built the same way, and I think that variation matters. Some testaments, like Issachar's and Zebulun's, which we'll reach shortly, center far less on personal confession and far more on a virtue the son once remembered: simplicity, compassion. Almost as though this book recognizes that not every life is best taught through failure alone, that some lives genuinely do offer a virtue worth holding up plainly, without needing a confessed sin to make the lesson land. I think that variation keeps the whole book from collapsing into a single flat formula: sin confession warning, repeated 12 identical times. It has real range, moving between hard confession and quiet, earned integrity depending on which brother is speaking. Joseph's testament comes next, and it's one of the longest and, I think, one of the most genuinely admirable in the whole collection. Joseph tells his own sons the full story your Bible already gives you in Genesis 39 through 45. Sold into slavery by his own jealous brothers, resisting Potiphar's wife's repeated advances at real cost to himself, imprisoned unjustly, and eventually raised to power in Egypt, where he chooses forgiveness over the vengeance that was fully within his power to take. What this testament adds is Joseph's own extended reflection on why he resisted temptation and chose forgiveness rather than retribution. Patience, he tells his sons, and the fear of God held steady across years of genuinely undeserved suffering, is what carried him through both trials. Ye see, therefore, my children, how great things patience worketh, and prayer with fasting, he says, urging his sons to model the same endurance he practiced across more than a decade of exile and imprisonment before his family's story finally turned toward reconciliation. I want to slow down on one more piece of Joseph's testament, because I think it's the most theologically striking single line in the whole collection outside of Levi's ascent. Reflecting on his brother's betrayal, the years of slavery and false imprisonment that followed, Joseph tells his sons that he never once considered revealing his brother's guilt to anyone in Egypt, and that he genuinely loved them despite what they had done to him. Not a performance of forgiveness offered reluctantly, but what the text presents as real, settled affection surviving intact underneath everything they'd cost him. He goes further still, telling his sons that God allowed his suffering specifically so that he might later demonstrate, through his own actual life, that whosoever worketh that which is good, the Lord loveth him. I think that's worth sitting with honestly, the way the whole rest of this book has trained us to sit honestly with hard material. This is a version of the Joseph story that reads less like the triumphant political rise your Genesis account emphasizes, and more like an extended meditation on what it actually costs, internally, to keep choosing integrity across more than a decade when every immediate incentive points the other way, toward bitterness, toward vengeance once the power to take it is finally available, toward at minimum a cooler, more guarded relationship with the brothers who sold him. Joseph's testament refuses all three of those easier paths, and it wants its readers to understand exactly how hard-won that refusal actually was. Benjamin's testament closes the collection, centered on purity of mind and generosity of spirit. And here I want to be honest with you about a detail that's clearly, unmistakably, a Christian addition to whatever older material this testament may be built on. Benjamin, in a prophetic vision near the end of his speech, foresees a figure who will be a worker of miracles and who will minister specifically to the Gentiles, language that reads, to nearly every scholar who has studied this passage, as a fairly transparent reference to the Apostle Paul and his own historical Gentile mission describes centuries in advance of when Paul actually lived. I want to flag this plainly rather than let it slide past unremarked, because it's exactly the kind of detail that anchors the later end of the Jewish core Christian shaping debate we opened with. A passage this specific, this clearly tied to events centuries after the patriarch Benjamin's own lifetime, is about as clear a marker of later Christian editorial hands as this entire book contains. I want to give the remaining 4 testaments real, individual attention now, rather than folding them into a single quick summary, because each one adds its own distinct piece to the larger picture this book is building. Issachar's testament centers on simplicity, a farmer's honest, uncomplicated devotion to God and to hard, patient labor. Issachar tells his sons that he lived his entire life without deceit, without envy of his brothers, without seeking anything beyond what his own labor in the fields honestly produced. And he frames that plain, unremarkable faithfulness as its own genuine virtue, deserving to be remembered every bit, as much as any dramatic confession of sin and recovery. I think there's something worth noticing in the fact that this book makes room for a testament like Issachar's at all. It would have been easy for a collection built so heavily around dramatic moral failure, Reuben's incest, Simeon's murderous envy, Judah's encounter with Tamar, to imply that only the spectacularly flawed have anything worth confessing. Issachar's testament pushes back against that implication. Quiet, faithful, unglamorous labor, sustained across an entire lifetime without a single recorded scandal, gets its own dying speech too, treated with exactly the same seriousness as his more dramatically flawed brothers. Zebulun's testament turns on compassion, and it adds a detail to the Joseph story your own Genesis account doesn't dwell on at length: Zebulun's own reported anguish and reluctance among all the brothers to see Joseph actually harmed. The testament describes him weeping in secret, refusing to eat for several days out of grief over what his brothers were planning, and eventually persuading them towards selling Joseph into slavery, specifically as an alternative to killing him outright, working alongside Judah's own recorded intervention in Genesis 37. Zebulun urges his own sons toward mercy as the single defining family virtue he wants remembered above all others, telling them that a heart which shows compassion will in turn receive compassion when it's most needed, a kind of moral reciprocity that echoes the Beatitudes' own "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy," even though centuries separate the two texts. Naphtali's testament, the very one echoed in that Hebrew fragment found at Qumran, describes a series of symbolic dreams about the future division and eventual reunification of the 12 tribes, framed as a natural order established by God from the very beginning. Each tribe assigned its proper place the way the sun, moon, and stars are assigned their proper courses through the sky. In one of these dreams, Naphtali sees his brothers scattered, each pursuing a different path, some faithful and some corrupted, before eventually being drawn back together into a single unified whole. I think it's worth noting how directly this dream imagery anticipates the actual, documented history of the 12 tribes. Genuine division after Solomon's reign, genuine scattering during the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests, and a persistent hope carried through the rest of the Old Testament's prophetic literature for an eventual, promised reunification. Naphtali's testament frames that whole future trajectory as something already visible, in outline, from the very founding generation of the 12 tribes themselves. I want to add one more historical note here, because I think it deepens Naphtali's dream imagery in a way worth knowing. The Hebrew fragment discovered at Qumran, matching this testament, wasn't found in isolation. It turned up among a wider collection of texts the Qumran community treasured specifically for their vision of Israel's 12 tribes eventually being restored to full, unified faithfulness, a hope that mattered enormously to a community that saw itself as a small, faithful remnant standing apart from a Jerusalem establishment it considered compromised. Knowing that context helps explain why a set of symbolic dreams about future division and eventual reunification would have been worth preserving carefully enough to survive, in fragmentary form, in a desert cave for roughly 2,000 years. And Gad's testament confronts hatred directly, confessing his own bitter resentment toward Joseph and warning his sons that hatred, left unchecked in the heart, poisons a man's judgment even more thoroughly and more permanently than the specific act of wrongdoing that first provoked it. Gad describes hatred as a force that actively distorts perception itself, making a hated person's good deeds look evil, and their evil deeds look even worse than they actually were, until the hater can no longer see the hated person clearly at all, only the accumulated weight of his own resentment projected back at him. Hatred, the Testament says, will not receive the tidings of God's commandments to love one's neighbor. It disposeth to slander him. I think that's genuinely sharp moral observation, describing something most of us have actually experienced from one side or the other. The way sustained resentment doesn't just color our judgment of a person, but actively degrades our capacity to judge them accurately at all. I want to spend a little more time on the two ways teaching before we move forward, because I think its reach across so many independent ancient communities deserves more than a passing mention. What strikes me most, sitting with Asher's Testament alongside the Qumran community rule and the Didache, is how consistently these separate communities insist that the two paths cannot be walked simultaneously, however much a person might want to convince themselves otherwise. Asher's Testament is unusually blunt on this exact point, warning against what it calls double-faced people, those who claim allegiance to good while quietly practicing evil, who steal and do violence while outwardly appearing righteous, and who therefore deceive not only the people around them but, more dangerously, themselves. I think that's worth naming plainly because it's a genuinely uncomfortable warning, and it doesn't let the reader off easy with the comfortable idea that sincere intentions excuse inconsistent action. The Testament insists a person's true path is revealed not by what they claim to believe, but by which way their actual choices, accumulated over time, actually bend. I want to widen this out for a moment into the wider family of ancient wisdom literature this whole two-path framework belongs to, because I think it helps explain why the image proved so durable across so many centuries and so many different communities. Long before any of these specific texts were written, Psalm 1 had already opened the entire Psalter with exactly this same two-path structure. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, contrasted directly against, the way of the ungodly shall perish. Proverbs returns to the same image again and again, contrasting the path of wisdom against the path of folly. Deuteronomy 30, right at the close of the Torah itself, sets life and good against death and evil as the two options Israel must choose between. What Asher's Testament, the Qumran community rule, and the Didache all do is take that ancient, deeply rooted biblical image and sharpen it into something closer to a formal doctrine, not simply a poetic metaphor scattered through wisdom literature, but an actual, named framework for understanding the entire architecture of human moral choice, two spirits or two inclinations contending directly for the same human heart. I think that sharpening tells us something real about the spiritual anxieties of the era these texts all emerged from. Communities living under real political pressure, real threats to their religious identity, who needed a clearer, more actionable moral framework than poetic metaphor alone could easily provide. I want to step back now and ask the question I think this whole book is really circling underneath all 12 individual confessions. Why did somebody, Jewish, Christian, or both across different stages of composition, feel the need to take Jacob's 12 brief, cryptic blessings and expand each one into a full human testimony, complete with confessed failure and hard-won wisdom? I think the honest answer is that a blessing alone, however poetic, doesn't teach you how to actually live. Jacob's verdict on Reuben, unstable as water, thou shalt not excel, tells you the outcome, but it doesn't show you the internal collapse that produced it. The 7 spirits of deceit working step by step, the exact texture of the failure a father might have wanted to spare his son by naming honestly rather than passing over in silence. This book, whoever ultimately wrote it and whatever hands shaped its final form, seems built on the conviction that real moral instruction requires confession, not just verdict, that showing your children exactly how you failed and exactly what you learned from failing does more good than simply pronouncing what you became. I want to name one more pattern before I turn to my own life. because I think it's the quiet thread tying all 12 testaments together underneath their surface differences. Every single one of these sons, whatever specific failure or virtue defines his individual speech, ends up in essentially the same posture by the time his testament closes, not standing in judgment over his own children from some position of achieved moral superiority, but kneeling, in a sense, beside them, saying, "Here is exactly what I got wrong or exactly what I got right, and here is what it actually cost me either way." Reuben doesn't lecture his sons about purity from some untouched moral high ground. He lectures them having already lost his birthright to impurity. Judah doesn't warn against greed and drunkenness as abstract dangers. He warns against them having already been publicly shamed by his own daughter-in-law's greater righteousness. Even Joseph, the Testament's clearest moral exemplar, frames his own endurance not as innate virtue but as something built slowly through years of prayer and fasting against real and repeated temptation to despair or revenge. I think that consistency across 12 otherwise very different speeches is the book's real argument, stated implicitly rather than announced outright. That moral authority earned through confessed failure and hard-won recovery carries more genuine weight for the next generation than moral authority claimed from a position that was never actually tested. I think about that conviction in relation to my own life, honestly, more than I expected to when I sat down to study this book. I've spent a long time, across a lot of years now, more comfortable handing my own children conclusions than confessions. The tidy, finished version of a lesson rather than the messy, humiliating process of actually learning it. I don't think that instinct is unique to me. I think it's the ordinary, understandable instinct of anyone who loves their children and doesn't want them to think less of you. But I've come to believe, the longer I sit with books like this one, that Reuben's sons and Judah's sons and Simeon's sons were probably better served by hearing their father's actual failures named out loud, in their own father's own voices, than they would have been by 12 short verses of poetic verdict alone. There's something a confession can teach that a conclusion never can. Not just what happened, but what it actually felt like from the inside, and what specifically it would have taken to choose differently. I want to bring one more comparison into view before we close, because I think this book earns a specific, distinct place on the shelf of buried scriptures we've built together across this whole channel. 2nd Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah both gave us vertical journeys, a visionary rising up through layered heavens toward increasing glory. The Apocalypse of Peter gave us judgment from beyond death, sins matched precisely to punishments. Melchizedek and Job's heavenly court both pulled back the curtain on a single mysterious verse, filling in a gap your own Bible leaves genuinely open. This book is doing something different in kind from all of those. It isn't primarily vertical, reaching upward toward heaven, and it isn't primarily concerned with the unseen machinery of judgment or divine counsel. It's horizontal, 12 ordinary human lives laid out side by side, each one confessing exactly how an ordinary person actually fails and exactly what it costs to recover, or in some cases simply to keep walking a quieter, more faithful path all along. I think that horizontal focus is exactly why this book has aged so well as moral instruction, whatever its uncertain canonical status. Heavenly ascents are dramatic, but they're also, for most of us, fairly distant from our actual daily struggle. 12 brothers confessing envy, anger, lust, greed, and hatred to their own children on their deathbeds. That's a kind of material every single reader, in every single era, can recognize immediately from the inside. I want to say a little more about why this particular literary form, the Farewell Testament, spoken from a deathbed to gathered children, carried so much weight in the ancient world, because I don't think it's simply a narrative convenience these authors happen to choose. A deathbed carries its own unique authority. A person facing imminent death has no further reason to perform virtue they don't actually possess, no future reputation left to protect through careful self-flattery, nothing left to gain from lying about their own life one final time. That's precisely why Jacob's own farewell blessing in Genesis 49 carries the weight it does in your canonical text, and it's precisely why this expanded collection, chose to keep that same deathbed setting for each of the 12 sons individually. A confession offered from any other position in life could always be suspected of some hidden angle, some ulterior motive. A confession offered from a deathbed, addressed to your own children, with nothing left to gain from the lie, reads as about as close to unguarded honesty as ancient literature generally allows itself to get. I also want to flag one more real scholarly angle here, because I think it deserves at least a brief, honest mention even in an episode already carrying a lot of ground. Some scholars have argued this text, or material closely related to it, may have had a genuine influence on early Christian ethical writing more broadly, not simply through the shared two-ways framework we've already discussed at length, but through the whole general practice of organizing moral instruction around specific named vices and virtues attached to specific recognizable figures, rather than abstract philosophical categories. Whether or not that specific influence can be proven with real confidence, I think it's worth noting that this confession plus virtue list plus warning pattern shows up again and again across later Jewish and Christian moral literature, long after this particular book itself had faded from wide circulation, suggesting that whatever these testaments were doing, structurally, tapped into something that felt genuinely useful to teachers across many later centuries, even once the 12 Patriarchs' own specific voices were no longer being read aloud. I want to close by returning one more time to that unresolved authorship question, because I think it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. We don't know with real certainty whether this book began as a purely Jewish work later touched by Christian hands, or as a Christian composition built from the start on older Jewish source material like the Aramaic Levi document. What we do know is that both possibilities point toward the same underlying truth about how real religious tradition so often actually works, not as one community inventing something from nothing, but as one community picking up material another community had already treasured, recognizing something true and worth keeping inside it, and carrying it forward into a new context that could make full use of what the earlier hands had only partly finished shaping. Whatever this book finally is, in the end, it's a testimony to how seriously both traditions took the idea that Jacob's 12 sons deserved more than 12 verses, that their real, complicated, failure-marked lives were worth the fuller telling somebody, eventually, sat down to give them. I want to leave you with one final thought before we close, because I think it's the piece of tonight's material most worth carrying past the end of this video. We tend to think of our ancestors, biblical or otherwise, in one of two flattened ways, either as untouchable moral heroes whose failures get quietly smoothed over in the retelling, or as cautionary tales reduced entirely to their worst moment, remembered only for the sin that defines them. This book refuses both flattenings for every single one of its 12 subjects. Reuben is neither excused nor reduced to nothing but his failure. He's given a full voice, failure and all, still worth listening to on his deathbed. Judah is neither elevated above his sin with Tamar nor erased by it. Both truths, the failure and the promised kingly line springing from it anyway, are allowed to sit side by side without either one canceling out the other. I think that's a genuinely mature way of holding a family's history, one I don't think we practice nearly often enough with our own families or, honestly, with ourselves. The people who shaped us were rarely purely heroes or purely cautionary tales. They were, almost without exception, something closer to what these 12 testaments actually give us. Real people, genuinely flawed, who still had something true and hard-won worth passing on before the end. If tonight gave you a reason to finally slow down and actually read Genesis 49 the way it deserves to be read, comment the word "watched" below. I read every single one. Send this to someone who's ever had to confess a hard truth to their own children, someone who's stood in that exact uncomfortable place Reuben and Judah stood in, deciding whether to hand the next generation a tidy, finished version of the story, or the real one, failures included. And if you want more of these forgotten and buried scriptures, subscribe to The Buried Scripture. Keep your Bible close. Keep asking what fuller story might be sitting quietly behind a verse you've always read as simple poetry. Keep room, too, in how you remember your own family's history For people to be both flawed and worth listening to at the very same time, that's not a contradiction these 12 testaments ever tried to resolve away, and I don't think we need to resolve it away either. And keep believing that confession, honestly offered, is very often the most useful inheritance a parent can actually leave behind. Thank you for spending this hour with 12 dying men and everything they still had left to say. Scripture quotations are from the King James Version. Details from the testament of the 12 patriarchs are drawn from the surviving Greek manuscript tradition, alongside the Aramaic Levi document and Hebrew Testament of Naphtali fragments discovered at Qumran in standard scholarly English translation, not the King James Version, since this book was never part of that translation. If you read any of this differently than I do, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Drop your thought in the comments below.